Hello everyone and welcome to our live stream looking at how we support young people who are struggling with self-harm. We're really glad you're here, whether you are watching us live or watching us back later. We really hope this is going to be a helpful space for you. And if you're watching live, we hope you will interact with us by popping any of your questions into the live chat as we go. We'll try to address them as we go. We will just say that if you've got particular questions about like one particular young person or a particular case, we're probably not going to get onto those type of questions today. But if you want to ask those questions, you are so welcome to email us, and our email address will pop along the bottom at different points so that you can get in touch if you want. So let's introduce ourselves just before we start. My name's Jenny Flanagan. There I am with a bit of hair frizz. And together with the other Jenny, who will introduce herself in a second, we manage a project called Illumina, which is part of Youthscape and also connected with Headstrong. And we work every single day of the week with young people struggling with self-harm. Illumina is a free online support program for 14 to 19-year-olds struggling with self-harm. So we run psychoeducation groups for young people regularly in every kind of weekday evening throughout the year. And, you know, generally we have about 1,000 young people contact us each year. So we're consistently talking to and working with young people who are trying to move towards recovery. And it's that experience that we're speaking from today. I'm also a psychotherapist, an art therapist, a counsellor. I work with adolescents and adults alongside my work at Youthscape. And I'll let Jen introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Jenny Cavendish. I also have very different hair in that picture as well. When I'm not working with Illumina, I'm training to be a psychotherapist and I work primarily with adults. And prior to this, I worked in schools, mostly around the Midlands, running the mental health provision. So as you can see there, we've also got a picture of our Illumina workbook, and that's available for sale from the Youthscape store. So you just search Illumina and Youthscape, then the book will come up, and that's an amazing resource to do in groups with young people. We know a lot of schools tend to use it, and we do have it available as a bulk order as well, if that's something you're interested into. And it sets out in a really similar way to the Illumina course, but is a way that you can work directly with a young person, or if that's not something that they're up for, it's something that they can do by themselves as well. But we hope that you find this a really helpful space this afternoon. So thanks for joining us.
Okay, well, let's crack on because we've only got an hour together and we want to be able to give you as much helpful information as possible in whatever context you are working in. So we're imagining that some of you are teachers or maybe other professionals working in schools. Some of you are youth workers, maybe social workers, others interacting with young people, and probably some of you as well are parents and you're dealing with this issue in a really personal way, maybe within your family at the moment. And so we're really hoping that what we're going to share with you this afternoon is going to help you in all those different contexts to know what helps, to help you make sense a little bit more of what's going on with these young people, and also to give you some hope, some courage, some encouragement to know that this work really can go in a good direction, that there is hope for young people who are self-harming. We've worked with so many young people who've made it out the other side to a life that's free from self-harm. So we know it's possible, and we really want to, just pass on, I guess, the wisdom that we've accrued in the years we've been working around this issue. So let's start with, why do people self-harm? Well, as you can imagine, it's not just one straightforward answer of this is the reason that all people self-harm. And I'm sure you know from your work with young people and your relationships with them that to say to any young person, oh, I understand self-harm, I absolutely understand why you're doing it, is a little bit belittling and maybe invalidating, because actually all of our stories are unique. And so everybody self-harms for a slightly different reason and within a slightly different context. But of course, there are patterns and there are things that we know from research that has been done, from conversations with young people who are self-harming, that can help us make a little bit more sense of this behavior, which can seem so just kind of counterintuitive. Like, why would you hurt yourself? Why would you choose? Why would anyone choose to hurt themselves? So I guess the first thing we would say is that there is always a story. That self-harm does not come from nowhere. It does not come from just someone deciding that they want to do it. That's not to say that they might not tell the story of like, I just decided to do it one day. But there is, we believe, always a deeper context, a deeper story to what has brought them to that point. And so part of the journey of moving towards recovery is starting to make sense a little bit of that. As I said, everyone's story is different, but I guess how we most often approach self-harm and understand it is that it is a way of managing, a way of coping with distress or with pain. So I guess our first assumption when we're working with somebody who's self-harming is that they are struggling. Either they have struggled historically and that is still affecting them, or things that are going on right now which are causing them pain and distress. And self-harm is a way of managing that and a way of coping with that. Now, self-harm might be about historic things that have gone on, like I said, like trauma. There might be things which, you know, even on paper, you can see are awful things for anyone to have gone through and would be difficult for anyone to cope with. But there might also be things which don't seem, I guess, so textbook horrific, but which still might be causing someone a lot of pain and distress, and they might not feel able to cope with it or manage it. And self-harm then becomes a way of coping and managing. Now, I've written here on the slide, self-harm is an extreme way to self-regulate, which is essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about coping. So self-regulation might be a term you're familiar with. The way I understand it is when we're regulating ourselves, we're basically trying to bring ourselves back to a feeling of being all right. So there are all kinds of things that throw us off center in a typical day, stressful things, annoying things that make us angry, things that make us sad. And then I guess in the bigger picture, there can be things that, you know, massively affect us in really difficult and painful ways. And when we're in that place where we're in pain and distress, we have an instinct to want to get to feeling okay again. It's a really natural, normal human thing. And there's all kinds of strategies that we might use. We might call a friend, we might make a cup of tea, we might have some chocolate. There's all kinds of big and small things that we might do to help ourselves feel okay. So self-harm is a quite extreme strategy that some people use as a way of getting them back to feeling okay. What they're feeling is really difficult, really painful, and they're looking for something that will help them feel okay again, and self-harm becomes that. And I guess the only other thing to say as well alongside that is that lots of people who self-harm struggle to make sense of why they self-harm themselves. And this is something we talk about with teenagers all the time. You know, some of them come to Illumina knowing exactly why they started self-harming and exactly why they continue to harm. And for some of them, that is a mystery and they really can't make sense of it. And they want us to help them to do that. So it's quite normal for teenagers to be able to make some sense of it, but it's also quite normal for them not to be able to make sense of it, not to be able to articulate or to describe to you why they harm. And that can feel really frustrating and difficult, but you know, that's often part of the process and part of what they're struggling with is disentangling and processing and making sense of what those things that feel really hard.
And I think kind of how we understand self-harm has really changed, and almost our understanding has grown over time as well. And a huge amount of that has come from us understanding more neuroscience. So getting a greater understanding of what's happening in the teenage brain. And one of the things that we know, especially about teenagers, is that they are much more likely to engage in what could be seen as risky behavior. And in a way, this is a really, really useful thing because it means that historically, it was teenagers who were willing to go and explore, go and find where was a safe place for a community to move to. And it's the same kind of thing as, you know, not many adults would go away to university and live with people that they don't know when they're 45. But actually, the almost risk of doing that is something that teenagers' brains are adaptable in a way of going, okay, I'll do this. But that also means that there's a much higher chance of taking other risks, that as adults we might look at it and go, well, that's not an okay way to deal with things. And alongside that, we've also got that teenagers experience highs and lows in a much more extreme way than adults. And if you speak to the teenagers around you, it's really common that they'll say, well, I feel like I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm anxious, I'm worried, I'm afraid, and all that's happened in kind of 15 minutes. But their brain hasn't fully developed to a state of being able to say, and I know this will pass. So it feels in those moments that those feelings that feel really extreme and unmanageable are going to go on forever, that they're not going to be able to find a way of changing those kind of feelings. And over time, so by the time you're about 25, the parts of the brain that help recognize and make sense of emotions, they are developed. But up until that age, it's still really difficult to work out, well, what do I do with this feeling? Is it going to last? Is it going to change? And the feelings become so intolerable that it can then feel like, well, I need to get rid of this feeling. I need to change it. I need to do something that makes me feel different somehow. And I think there's kind of like a double side of this, because we can sometimes get a bit like, oh, well, they'll grow out of self-harm. They're just doing this because they're a teenager. Whereas we know from the young people that we work with that invalidates the emotional pain that somebody is feeling. It isn't something that's helpful. It isn't something that's supportive. A young person mentioned to me recently, it's a bit like saying when sort of we've lost somebody really close to us, oh, you'll get over that grief. And although we may know that in some parts of us, actually the pain and the distress that we're feeling at that moment feels really painful and really distressing. And that's what's happening for our young people. And if you're interested in knowing more about the teenage brain, then I always recommend this book. We're not on commission, but I think it's brilliant. So this is Brainstorm by Daniel Siegel. And he writes a huge amount about understanding what's going on for the teenage brain. So if that's something that you find helpful, then I'd recommend that book as well. But when we talk about what's going on for teenagers, then especially, this is one of our big questions. And Stephen's asked, how do you initially engage with teenagers who appear to be self-harming? And we'll be talking kind of about that generally over the rest of this session, but especially it's accepting the young person for who they are. We're going to be talking about some of the things that aren't helpful to do, but especially helping somebody to recognize actually you have a huge amount of worth, and we want to help you to regulate what it is that's going on for you at the moment. We want to help you in the way it is that you're going to manage, and we're going to be talking about in a moment. So we'll come back to that as a question in a little bit as well. But we know that there are lots of myths as well that can kind of feed into a bit of fear that as adults we might have when we know that somebody is self-harming. And one of those especially is that feeling of, well, if they're self-harming, they must be suicidal. And actually a huge amount of the young people that we speak to and sort of adults that we know that self-harmed at different times will say, actually, I didn't feel suicidal. I don't feel suicidal. But instead, I felt so out of control and everything felt so overwhelming. Or the opposite of that, I felt so numb and I felt like I don't know how to manage this because I feel so disconnected from everything. That's the part that feels unmanageable. And so self-harm doesn't mean that somebody feels suicidal, but it could, but often it doesn't. And we can't come into it with a fear of, and this is what it is that this means. A little bit like when people will say that someone is self-harming and it's attention seeking. Whereas in our experience, they may well be looking for connection. They may well be feeling nobody understands me, but that is also a very common experience. I think if you spoke to all teenagers all over the country, I definitely remember that when I was a teenager, I felt very misunderstood. And I definitely showed in my behavior that I wanted to connect with people. There may well also be teenagers that you know and you work with who have self-harmed for a really long time and it goes under the radar. It isn't about, I'm trying to get attention with this. It isn't also a phase, although we've talked about what it is that's going on in the teenage brain. Self-harm isn't something that people are doing just because they're a teenager or just because their friends are doing it. We know that self-harm is a response to feelings and emotions or events it is that people have had that they've experienced. And over time, we would really love for our young people to understand themselves and be able to make sense of that. But at the moment, it can feel so overwhelming and so frightening. It can be like, well, I can't talk to somebody about this. If I do, this is what they're going to believe. They think I'm doing it just for attention, or I'm doing it just because I'm a teenager. And we also know the myth that people will say they could stop if they wanted to. But there is an addictive quality to self-harm, and it's important that we acknowledge that. There is a feeling of, I felt a certain way, and self-harm stops me, even just for a moment of feeling that way. And feeling that way is so intolerable, then I will do anything I can to stop feeling that way in that moment. And so although some young people may self-harm for a couple of months and then never do it again, we know that other people would say, actually, it feels addictive, and I'm addicted to how I feel afterwards, and the chemicals and the hormones that are released in my body. And all the alternatives that people have given me haven't made me feel the way that that does. And it's really helpful if you're working with young people to acknowledge these things, to acknowledge that you know that they are not self-harming for attention, that they're not doing it just because they're teenage and everybody else is. But especially also that you're not saying to them, well, I know that you can stop this if you wanted to, and I'm expecting you to stop immediately like this.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about how we respond. And this is a question that comes up a lot. Should I get rid of their equipment? So often when young people, when anyone is self-harming, they will know how they harm, and they will have particular equipment that they will probably use. And it often seems like the most obvious thing to do to get them to stop is just to take that away. Then they won't be able to do it. This can be an incredibly dangerous thing to do, because the reasons, the kind of instincts that are getting them to self-harm, they're not rational for a start. So just taking rid of their equipment isn't going to get them thinking, oh, well, I can't do that, I'll just do something else. It's coming at a very emotional place, a very instinctive place, a very kind of, I guess in our brain terms, a kind of early development place. And it feels like a real visceral need. And if suddenly all the things that they would regularly use aren't there, those feelings don't go away. And so what will often happen is that a young person will then look for other things, and there will usually be things that are less safe. So equipment that they haven't sterilized, or that they haven't been keeping clean, things that they've just managed to find on the street. And so it can end up pushing them into more dangerous behavior. So I know it sounds counterintuitive to not take away the thing that you know is causing them danger, but actually that in itself can be an incredibly dangerous thing to do. Because if the underlying need to self-harm and the underlying issues and the things causing pain, if those things haven't been addressed, then they will still have that same urge. It's kind of similar to other addictive behaviors, and people will sometimes use the analogy of a house. Like if a scaffolding is holding a house up, you don't suddenly just take away the scaffolding and expect the house to stay up on its own, unless you're going to put something else in there in order to hold the house up. So if a young person feels like they're dependent for their sense of being okay and being able to cope on that mechanism, taking away is not going to suddenly make them discover, oh, they were fine after all. They're going to feel like, in serious danger of collapse. So that's our first piece of advice. But now coming, I guess, more specifically to Stephen's question, how should we respond? And of course, it's a little bit different as to the particular role or relationship we have. But we know there are some things which are really, really important in how we respond from things that young people have said. And the first thing is that it's really important not to freak out. Now, I guess we use freak out as a way of talking about all kinds of really strong reactions that you might have. Of course, we will react when we see self-harm. We almost can't help it. And especially if it's someone in our family, if it's someone we deeply care about, we can't help but have a visceral reaction to seeing someone hurting themselves. And sometimes maybe that might come out as anger, it might come out as panic, it might come out in all kinds of different ways. But those kind of big reactions are really unhelpful and actually often quite scary for young people. A lot of young people tell us that they don't disclose their harming to people in their family or people around them because they don't want to be a burden, because they don't want to freak them out, because they know that it really upsets them. And so then they're left kind of struggling alone because they just feel like they need to protect the adults around them. So it's really important that we can be calm, um, even if that's not how we feel inside. So I guess I want to recognize that we will have those strong reactions, and those are normal and those are fine. And we're not saying for a second you shouldn't have those responses. And we're maybe going to speak a little bit at the end about what maybe you might need to do to get the support you need if you're working in this kind of context. But whatever you are feeling, it is so important that you can stay calm and give the young person a sense that you can see what's going on and you're still okay. You're still calm, you can still manage this, it's going to be all right. Not that you know how to fix it or solve it, I'm not saying that, but that you can give a sense of it's okay. I can cope with this. I can see it. I want to understand it. And this what you're doing isn't going to become a burden to me, a thing that kind of sends me over the edge or into kind of a breakdown myself. So staying calm. And then being a supportive and listening, non-judgmental presence. We can often feel completely overwhelmed by this issue. And, you know, Jen and I have been working with it for many years, and we'll still hear new stories and new perspectives and new feelings. And it's not that we can make sense of every situation, but there's something about just being really curious, really supportive, letting someone know, I think I can see that you're harming, or I think I can see that you're hurting yourself. And that tells me that you're struggling in some way. And I would really love to understand what's going on for you, why things are hard, anything that you want to tell me. So not judging them, listening, supporting them, and making it clear that you want to understand how they feel. It can be so easy to make little comments or little responses that invalidate how the young person is feeling. And we hear this all the time from young people. The teacher who says, you're just overreacting, you know, this is not an appropriate reaction, or other people are dealing with far worse, other people are managing to cope with their exams, why can't you? Anything that tries to almost kind of pressure them into feeling something else, or to tell them that they should be feeling something else, or even shame them for what they're feeling. Like, what's wrong with you that you can't cope? What's wrong with you that you have those feelings? Those are the absolute worst things that we can communicate to a young person. Make it clear that you want to understand from them and take seriously what it is that they're experiencing and they're going through. Now, of course, from a safeguarding perspective, for many of us, there's going to be a practical component to that, which is about helping them to take care of themselves. We're going to need to assess how dangerous what is going on, whether they know how to keep their wounds clean, what the context is, who else we're going to need to tell. And I'm hoping that whatever institutions you work in, if this is your professional work, that you have safeguarding policies. Schools should all have a safeguarding policy that relates to self-harm. So I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I would say that it's an important question to ask a young person, like, do you know how to look after any of your wounds to make sure that they don't get infected? Do you know how to keep things clean and safe? Do you know how to avoid main blood vessels? Those kinds of things. And if you want more details about that, like, do email us and we can send you links to things which go into a lot more detail about the practicalities. But it's, you know, it's a caring question to ask them. Do you know how to keep your wounds safe? Can I just see that they're okay? Can I help dress your wounds? And then I guess the last thing I'd say about how that initial response is, you know, a young person might say, I want to change. I don't want to keep harming. I don't know how to stop. It can take a long time to change this behavior because it's so tied up with our feelings, our way of understanding and coping with the world. It can be to do with things that have happened a long time ago. So just be careful with your expectations of the young people that you're with. We often say to young people, that it's really important they understand this journey can take a long time. It's going to have ups and downs and highs and lows. There'll be times where you feel like you're going around in circles or you're back at square one. But what matters is that you keep showing up for this journey, and knowing that they have your support for however long it's going to take is going to be really important and really helpful for young people.
I can see that lots of comments have come in around the safeguarding side of things. And I think that's a conversation that has to happen in individual organisations at an individual level. I've worked in some schools that have a policy that's set by the trust that manages schools. I've worked for some churches where they have to adopt a policy that comes from sort of the type of church it is, that kind of thing. But it can be a conversation that happens between you as a safeguarding team. It can be a conversation that happens as part of safeguarding policies. But I think it's always good to be part of a wider conversation of people that are involved in that. So it might be that you want to kind of seek advice from Young Minds or charities like that as well, and kind of see some of their template policies. But it's sort of such a particular thing that different people will have different policies as well. So I don't think we can advise particularly on that anymore, because it will be dependent on your own organisation. But I think it's also really helpful for us to remember that self-harm is a symptom of what it is that is going on for the young person, that self-harm isn't an illness. We'll hear a lot of young people that will say, oh, we can't now go on our family holiday because they say I can't go till I stop self-harming, and these kind of things, as if self-harm is something, well, as soon as we found the cure, then it's going to change. And self-harm isn't something that we reach a diagnosis of as well. All manner of people with some diagnosis and some not may well self-harm in times where they feel dysregulated, and in times where they feel overwhelmed or numb by everything it is that's going on. And so if we see self-harm as a symptom of something that is bigger, that is impacting the young person, it helps us see the young person as who they are, rather than their self-harm coming first and then who they are from that as well.
So we're going to speak a little bit now about the self-harm cycle, and hopefully this will just help to make a little bit more sense about what is going on specifically when someone self-harms. So this is something that we talk through regularly with young people themselves, as a way to help them make a little bit more sense of what's happening. And we often ask them, tell us which bits you recognise or which bits you don't recognise. But I guess most of the feedback we have is that this feels like familiar, and it feels like it helps a lot of people to make sense a little bit more of what's going on. So if we start with perhaps at the top of the, I wouldn't say circle, but it's more of a square, isn't it? Diamond. A trigger event increases distress. So triggers are something that we talk about loads. But like young people use the language of triggers all the time nowadays. A trigger is really just a connection. It's a connection between something that happens, either something that's said, something, an event playing out, or seeing a particular person. It can be a particular intrusive thought or a flashback, something that happens internally. But something happens which connects with something in our brain which feels painful and maybe even overwhelming. And that leads us to feeling like we need to do something to escape those feelings. They feel really overwhelming and horrible, and we just want to get rid of them. And it's a human thing, isn't it? We all want to escape and run from pain, and we have different ways that we all do that. So with self-harm, someone gets to that point and feels like self-harm is the thing that will help them escape that feeling. And so they'll harm. And then what will happen is, as a result of the harming, they will feel different. And that is why they do it, because when they self-harm, everything changes about how they feel. So maybe they were feeling numb and now they feel awake and alive. Maybe they were feeling overwhelmed and overcome and now they feel a sense of calm. Perhaps they were feeling just overcome by emotional pain, and suddenly all they can feel is physical pain. And that is much more preferable to feeling emotional pain. Physical pain can feel a lot more manageable than emotional pain. So they harm in order to feel that relief or that release, that feeling of difference. But of course, that feeling doesn't last. It's short-lived. And often the more someone harms, the less long it lasts. And so then what happens is you tend to get a negative reaction. We often call it a grief reaction. It might be a feeling of guilt that I self-harmed when I didn't want to, or a feeling of shame, like I'm a bad person, I can't help this. It might be feeling of fear or anxiety because my parents are going to find out, or someone's going to find out and I'm going to be in trouble, or I'm just going to really upset them, I'm going to disappoint people. That negative reaction can take all kinds of different forms, and the majority of young people we work with would recognize that. If someone has been harming for a long time, they might not recognize that part so much. When it's a really ingrained behavior, they might have lost some of that sensitivity to the negative reaction to the harm. And then what goes on is that the circumstances of life continue, the things which are already difficult or already painful or stressful haven't gone away. And so they build up until a trigger point moves us around. So this is the cycle that someone in any kind of addictive behavior actually will go round, and that is also familiar for those who are self-harming. And some people will take quite a long time to move around that cycle if they don't self-harm that often, and other people will feel like they race around it at a race of knots, kind of never being able to catch their breath. And the reason that we share that with young people is that it gives them a chance to make a little bit more sense of things that often feel very blurred and confused and mixed up together. And when they have some more awareness of what is going on and why they're harming, it takes them closer to the place where they're able to make some choices at different points. If they can realize where I am today or where I am this moment on the self-harm cycle, they have a better chance of being able to think, well, what helps at this point and what else could I do? And then this slide, I guess, gives a little bit, a slightly wider picture, I guess, of how we understand the cycle. All we've done is really move the cycle I've just talked through round to the right. And then to the left, we've put this list of things which aren't mentioned in the cycle, but for us feel like really what drives that cycle. You know, the young person themselves might be aware of the thing that triggered me today, or the thing that's hard today and why I self-harmed and how I felt afterwards. But actually what we try to get them to do is to just take a step back from that, to understand that what's pushing them around that trigger is usually a list of other things, which the self-harm doesn't touch, of course. So that might be things like memories from the past, loss that they've experienced, fear, pain, abuse, trauma, identity struggles, relationship breakdowns, family issues, sexuality struggles, rejection. It's not a comprehensive list. But these are really the issues which are coming into play and which the self-harm cycle is an attempt to deal with and to cope with. And so we try to help young people to understand that whilst they're kind of looping round the cycle, there's actually another dimension of it, which is usually driving them around it, that they need to stop and become a little bit more aware of.
Because for any work it is that you're doing with young people, we've got two things to do. We've got the first, which is helping them make sense of why they self-harm. And that might be something that is your job. That might be something that you have a really small part on, or it might be something that you signpost them to other places that they can get that support from. And that's helping them work out what's their story. What are their list of things that we showed in the slide before? What are the things that are going on for them? What are the things that at the moment are causing them to feel overwhelmed and frightened and so out of control in some of their emotions? An example of things that like that might be if they've been dating somebody and the relationship's ended, then they have the sadness and the memories of what the relationship was like. But then every time they see that person at school, they feel the sadness and the jealousy pop up again. So they might be able to recognize, well, I self-harm after going to school, but by thinking through, well, what's the story? It's being able to recognize, and maybe that's linked to some of the memories you have of how things used to be. And some young people will be able to do that really easily. And some young people will need to work with counsellors or therapists to be able to unpack some of that area, depending on what their story is. But alongside that, it's really important that young people know what practical alternatives there are for them as well. So other things to help soothe them, distract them, support them, express themselves, cheer them up. Really straightforward things like making sure that young people know some breathing techniques. And you can watch back if you didn't see our last YouTube live around anxiety, where we've talked through a lot of breathing and grounding techniques. But it's also space to go, actually, how can we help them express themselves? Is that through music, sport? Is it through giving them a list of people that they can contact when they need to, like different crisis lines? And lots of our young people will say, well, alternatives don't work for me. And that's because they've often been given a list of alternatives and told, do these things. Or they've been given one alternative of flick a rubber band around your wrist every time you want to self-harm. And so they try that 3 times and find it doesn't work. And so start going, well, nothing's ever going to work for me. But we want them to recognize that it needs both of these things in partnership, that there is a desire for working out what their story is and working out what's causing them the pain and distress, but then also alongside looking at the alternatives, but also looking at what else do they need? Are they able to soothe themselves? Are they able to help them relax? Do they need some more space to be able to learn how to be distracted? Do they learn how to cheer themselves up? All of these kind of things. And so the 2 goals of these 2 working in partnership are kind of the best ways in our experience of being able to support young people.
I wonder if it's worth saying as well, just something about because we often have this conversation with young people where we say, tell us all of the things that you've been told to try, tell us the things that work, tell us the things that don't work. We often hear the story about how the most useless thing in the world to get told to do is to make a cup of tea, as if that's going to be enough to help them stop their really strong urges to self-harm. But one of the things that we emphasize with them is I guess what it takes to build a new habit, that the first time you try something new, like punching a pillow or whatever it is that you decide to try, it feels weird, it feels unnatural. It's your brain doesn't really understand why you're doing that, because your brain's saying, when we feel this, we self-harm and that helps us feel better. And so it can't really make sense of the fact that you're trying to do this strange thing with rubber bands or newspaper instead. But there's something to be said for just trying it a few times and seeing. And we always encourage young people to see it as like a process of experimentation, where I can't tell them what's going to work for them, and what works for them isn't going to work for the next person, but they're the ones who are going to need to find the things that work. And that's going to have to involve doing a few of the wrong things and feeling a bit awkward, doing things that you're not really sure are working very well, before we're going to get to that point where they start to feel more helpful.
And I think something about putting yourself into their shoes, isn't it? I know if I'm feeling quite stressed by something, I'm like in my 30s and I still have my go-to, this is what I would do type things. I think the pandemic helped so many of us go, oh, when I'm stressed, I shop. Or, oh, when I'm stressed, I go for a run. And we learned that about ourselves. But I know how I'd feel if somebody said to me, oh, instead, I think you should do this. There'd be a part of me that's like, but I know mine works.
Yeah.
I know this is something that has solved me. And maybe you do something differently and you don't agree with how I do things, but mine works. And I think we have to acknowledge that with our young people and go, at the moment, self-harm works. And you might need to be doing 2 things at the same time. You might want to try 5 times trying something else. And on 4 times of those, you will self-harm, but on 1 time, you'll do something differently. So it isn't a case of going, we're going to take this away and go and flick a rubber band and you'll be fine. It's how do we have this kind of partnership? Yeah. And one of our best things, I think, is recognizing and helping young people recognize their feelings and their emotions. And actually, however old you are, I think a feelings wheel like this is absolutely brilliant. I always joke that before I got married, my husband could recognize that he was hungry, and that's about it. So having a feelings wheel is an amazing way of going, oh, what am I feeling now? Let me check in with myself. And we will have young people who have been taught through schools, families, people around us, that only certain feelings are okay. So perhaps they've grown up with everybody being very angry, and they've said to themselves, well, I'm never going to be angry because anger hurts people. Or maybe they've been taught you have to be happy all the time, because if you're happy, then that makes the adults around you happy. If you're sad, then makes them sad. You don't want to make them sad, do you? No, go and be happy. And so we will have young people that won't be able to recognize their own emotions and might not be able to identify what it is that they're feeling. And their self-harm may well be linked to different feelings that they have. But if they're not able to recognize that, then they're almost coming a bit more from a disadvantage as well. So I think if you're working with young people, the more you can model this, the better it is. The more you're able to recognize, I feel a bit sad that that situation happened. I wonder if you feel sad as well. I feel disappointed that that didn't go in the way that we hoped it was going to. I wonder if you feel disappointed. And then also alongside that, model, when I feel disappointed, I need to think about some of the good things that have happened in the past. I need to remind myself what other people say about me. I need to watch a film where I can have a good cry. All of these kind of things. So normalizing that our feelings are a normal thing. Feelings won't last forever. But for a lot of our young people, there is a fear that my feelings are going to take over. My feelings are going to impact somebody else. Or I have to manage my feelings by myself. And my experience has been, if I tell somebody this is what I'm feeling, they minimize it and they shut me down and say I shouldn't be feeling like that. And so if you can use something like a feelings wheel or encourage young people around you to be doing something like this, it can then help broaden their language. And if they're young people who are good at making lists and find that helpful, they may also want to write down what some different alternatives they might use for different feelings. So looking at it, they might say, well, I only ever self-harm when I'm sad. But a feelings wheel, this one's quite small, so you might not be able to see very well. It's got things like isolated and fed up under sadness. And we may be encouraging them to do really different things when they're isolated compared with when they're fed up. So it's about recognizing both of those are experiences of sadness, but actually I will treat those differently, and therefore I will treat myself differently with them. The same as feeling overwhelmed and anxious are both different types of fear. But again, as an adult, I would do different things to look after myself if I was feeling anxious compared with overwhelmed. So it's about how we can model that for the young people that are around us as well. You can find feelings wheels just by Googling feelings wheel sort of online. There's a huge amount of different ones available. There's some that have pictures to show what different faces look like at different times. There's some that some young people say that's too busy, I just need a black and white one, all of those different things. So it's the kind of thing that I will often show young people 3 or 4 different things and say, do any of these click for you? Are any of these helpful? Is this the kind of thing that you enjoy using? So you can get creative with that too. Some people like making their own as well and recognizing and highlighting when they notice I feel different things, or this is what I do for myself when I feel this.
So emotional literacy is something that we talk a lot about with young people around the area of self-harm, because it's a real challenge for young people who are self-harming to be able to make sense of their emotions. And that's when they start to feel overwhelming or threatening, or like there's something drastic that needs to happen in order for them to manage them. So we do a lot of work helping young people to make sense of their emotions. One of the questions which I often hear from parents, either directly or indirectly, is a fear that if my child is self-harming, then in some ways it is my fault. Of course, that isn't true. You know, self-harm is it comes from a variety of different factors. There's no way to predict who's going to self-harm. It's a combination of things that somebody has experienced, how they have particularly responded to them. There are elements which are to do with their environment and their upbringing and how easy they find it to make sense of their emotions. But just because you're someone who's grown up in a home, I grew up in a home where no one really talked about emotions, and I didn't self-harm. So it's not that I'm saying one leads to the other, but often when we struggle as adults to make sense of our own feelings, when we struggle to be able to talk about them, and bring them out in the open, then that can make it harder for our kids to know how to do that as well. So there are factors about a young person's experience which will contribute to how well or otherwise they feel able to make sense of their emotions, and how they choose to regulate. But it's never like the fault of a parent or a particular teacher or a particular individual. And it can be hard not to feel like we need to ask those questions about us, of ourselves, but they really don't help a young person for us to be focused on what have I done and how have I caused this, because actually what the young person needs is for us to be able to, to meet them where they are at now, regardless of what's brought them to that place, to meet them and to be able to be curious and to be open and to be able to really hear what's happening for them and what they're experiencing without descending into our own reactions or our own defenses. And that's something which is incredibly difficult. And often when we're supporting someone who self-harms, we need a lot of support around us. We have some friends who actually run an organization specifically for parents of young people who are self-harming, called the Youth Mental Health Foundation. You can find them at youthmentalhealthfoundation.org, and they offer actually a free online course specifically for parents that looks at how can you play an active role in supporting your child when they're struggling with self-harm, and what support do you need? Because it might need that you need a new space, you need to have some support, some therapy, perhaps, so that you are able to kind of process everything that's coming up for you in doing this work and in supporting your child, and so that you're not putting that into the relationship with the child and trying to resolve all that with them, but you can really be attuned to them and what they particularly need and what's going on for them. Yeah, Jen.
Right. So we spoke to some of the young people that we work with, and these are all young people that have done our course and have kind of like, we've been supporting for a while now. And we said, what are the things that don't help? And so these are some of the things that came up. And one is the word just. Oh, it's just because you're a teenager. Oh, it's just because of your hormones. We hear that a lot. Hormones, just because of your hormones. Oh, the wounds I've seen worse, they're just superficial. Just because of this is what's going on for you. And immediately in those moments, the young person hears the word just. And the word just is linked to, and therefore I don't matter. Therefore, this is just what's going on for me because of the other things that are happening. And it minimizes that young person's experience. And it minimizes their ability to be able to ask for help in the future. And often it's something that we might say without even thinking about it. But it's also linked to when we might say to young people, oh, you don't want to do that. If you do that, no one's going to want to date you in the future, or all those kind of things. And anything like that is that way of saying to that young person, well, you don't matter as a person. So being able to recognize what it is that's going on and see that young person and the pain they're in that moment is really, really important. We've also heard, as Jenny mentioned earlier, that actually young people find it really upsetting and worrying when the adults around them are panicking about it. Because they are so frightened, they need the containment of an adult. They need somebody to be able to help them be contained by what it is that they're feeling and to kind of provide those boundaries around for them. And because they know that they're not able to do that for themselves in that moment, they need to know that other adults around them can contain them. And although you may be panicking and you may be frightened or worried about it, they won't find it helpful to know that. They need to know that you are able to hold this and to be with them in this in a really supportive way. We've also heard a lot of that anything that invalidates how somebody feels or doesn't take them seriously isn't helpful. And that's a lot of the things of like, well, I knew so-and-so and they did it much worse. Or why are you worried about that? It's only an exam. Don't worry about that. You'll be fine. you just ignore them, move away, all of those kind of things. That rather than helping them to recognize and own what it is that they're feeling, it's that way of invalidating them, of minimizing what it is that's going on. And young people will often tell us that they feel like they're a burden in those kind of situations. So it feels like, well, if nobody around me takes my feelings seriously, then why should I? Can I? Is it okay for me to do that? And it could lead them to feel quite confused about, well, what happens to me now? If I feel all these emotions, but everyone's telling me not to, do I just push them down? Do I express them more? What do I do? And we know that young people say, actually, I need to know that other people are okay with me expressing what's going on for me. And that they're okay with me saying, I feel angry right now, I feel frightened, I feel worried. And that can be a really hard and a really tough thing to do, whether you're doing that as a pastoral member of school staff, as a parent, as a youth worker, any other kind of provision, that can be tough. But actually, it might make a huge difference. In fact, we know it does make a huge difference to our young people to know that they are being held and contained by the adults around them. And the other thing we hear especially is people saying, well, as soon as I'd stopped harming, then everybody said, well, that's fine, you're sorted now. Everything's okay. And that's why it felt so important to us to put there, we need both. We need to help young people understand their story, and we need to help them live a life free from self-harm, because they are able to soothe and support and distract and use alternatives as well. So helping them to go, actually, the self-harm might not be happening at the moment, but we are able to help you regulate your emotions in all situations is massively important as well.
Great. We've got a good question as well. Is it wise to do group sessions for friends that are self-harming, or is one-to-one better? Now, I'm not going to give you a black and white answer, I'm afraid, on this, because that's a really good question, and it's a bit complicated. The majority of the work that we do is in groups, and we know young people find that phenomenally helpful because it helps them to feel less alone. They tell us that they experience a huge amount of support from one another. So, the benefits to us are huge, but then we are working online with people anonymously where they can't see and hear each other. And so they're not there with their friends. When I've worked in groups in school doing this kind of work, it can feel a lot harder to get going because people tend to feel a lot more shame around their self-harming when they're in person. And somehow when we work on a computer online with people, they kind of manage to bypass that, maybe because no one can see exactly who they are. At the same time, if you're working with one or two or three people who are friends who already know about each other's harming, that that can be a phenomenal resource. The support that they have for each other, the care and the way that they're going to champion each other. Often young people who are harming find it easier to give advice and support to other people, and find it really hard to offer that same kind of kindness towards themselves. So it can be a really amazing resource to draw on. It's just probably worth gauging whether they're able to talk about that with each other. And I guess there's always a risk that there's some unhealthy dynamics around, like, how much are you harming? So you'd have to have some really good ground rules around how to have those conversations. But I would say it can be amazing. We certainly see the benefit of peer support in the model of work that we do. So I hope that's helpful.
And I think probably alongside that, it's important to name whichever way it is that you're doing it, but to name with the young people, what are our boundaries here? Because if you're working one-to-one with 10 young people who are all friends, they're going to talk. And so it's then really important to go, well, how are you going to change the way you talk to each other? That you're not looking for something with each other. You're getting the support from us here, and you're talking well to each other. And that might be the same in groups as well. So that then you know that they're also encouraging each other and having really healthy conversations about self-harm outside of that group setting as well. Whereas we don't have that because our young people aren't able to contact each other.
Yeah. And I guess boundaries around what's said in that little group that then won't get talked about in a slightly wider friendship circle. I'm sure you know to think through all those things. So a few thoughts about the importance of communication. it's really hard to talk about self-harm. We as adults find it hard often because we have all kinds of reactions to it. And it's hard to not let some of those reactions and attitudes kind of trickle out in what we say. It can feel really confronting and really awkward. Young people often feel very ashamed of their harming and find it incredibly hard to talk about it. Often, it's because they find it hard to talk about their feelings and their struggles that they're looking for other ways of coping, such as self-harm. So that can be a really helpful thing to acknowledge, to say, I know this is a really hard conversation, and if I make mistakes in what I say, like, please let me know and tell me, because I want to be really respectful. But I think it's much better that we can talk about it than not. Those kinds of things are helpful. And like I said before, in terms of how a young person might make sense of their harming, often that's really hard for them. A lot of young people don't understand why they harm, or they understand where they started, but not really why they've continued, or they didn't understand at the start, but now they can understand why they're doing it now. We get all kinds of different versions of that in our work with young people. So asking a young person to try and explain it as best they can, but also being really supportive and fine with understanding that it's a really hard thing to talk about and make sense of. And that it's okay if you can't totally make sense of it, but I guess to show that you want to understand and you want to help them understand. There's been some amazing research that we talk about a little bit in Illumina, which is about how, which has shown that if we can find words to explain our feelings, it actually often decreases our distress and we start to feel calmer. And that's all to do with the different parts of the brain where we're feeling the emotion and where we're drawing the language from. But even, using a feelings wheel with a young person, anything that you can do, even just for them to say, I'm angry or I'm sad or I'm anxious, that can start the process of making a little bit more sense of that mess of feelings, but it can also start to get them into a calmer place. If talking face to face is difficult, it is for a lot of young people who've been, locked down and all kinds of things like that. Find other creative ways in order to, I guess, facilitate communication. It might be texting, it might be instant messaging. We obviously have found this strange platform that we use for Illumina where young people just communicate with us on a chat box, but they can see and hear us rather like you can in this live stream. But looking for ways to communicate that feel supportive to them. I know about people who leave messages or different kind of coloured coding systems on their fridges at home to communicate with their parents a little bit about how they're feeling when they find it really hard to talk. And maybe if you are someone who has a relationship with a young person and it doesn't feel like you're getting somewhere, is there another emotionally available adult, especially if you're a parent and your kid is really struggling to talk to you? Is there another adult around that they have a good relationship with? They don't need to be an expert, but someone who will listen to them and help them make sense of what is going on, something that can make all the difference.
So it's so important that you from here think about how it is that you're going to be looking after yourself and looking after the people around you. We know as professionals that supervision is massively helpful. So if you're a youth worker, pastoral worker in a school, anything like that, getting adequate supervision is massively important. You may also want to consider some therapy for yourself to find and make sure that you've got the right kind of adults around you as well. So keep that in mind in the conversations it is that you will be having. What am I doing to look after myself? And if I'm here as part of a wider family, how are we supporting the other children, the other people around us in this household as well?
Brilliant. So I think that brings our webinar to a close, unless anyone has any final questions that they'd like us to respond to before we finish. We're just tracking with the comments. Yeah, otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Remember, you can email us. We're really happy to respond to questions about like individual cases or individual young people over email. So do feel free to get in touch, or if there are things that we've raised, questions that you have about I saw some about safeguarding and about other sources of help, we're really happy to respond to those. So yeah, drop us an email. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Fabulous. Thanks so much for coming and joining us, and we wish you all the best in the future for the work it is that you're doing. So thank you.